Welcome everyone, this is Bill Lester here, and in this video we're going to learn all about weed identification and management. Some of the points we're going to cover are how are lawn and landscape weeds identified, and what are the management strategies for lawn and landscape weeds. Some of the skills you will learn is how to identify weeds commonly encountered in lawns and landscapes. You will learn methods to manage weeds and how to interpret an herbicide label. So, what is a weed? A weed is a plant out of place. It can be any plant, but it's generally a small group of plants. Weeds compete with desirable plants for nutrients, water, light, and space. Weeds can also be a source for pest insects, diseases. They can overwinter or oversummer in the weeds and then move back into your valuable plants. Many weeds can be poisonous. They can have harmful spines, thorns, and then of course there's a reduced aesthetic value and they're unsightly. Being able to identify weeds is a very important part of the management process, and there's a number of different ways that we classify weeds. A number of these are very similar to what we covered in botany in Module 1. They could be grouped as annual, biennial, or perennial life cycle. They can be grouped as grasses, broadleafs, or sedges. This is a very important way of grouping them or classifying them because that aligns very closely with the type of herbicide you would use to control them. Weeds can grow in terrestrial environments, also aquatic environments. We have a large number of aquatic weeds here in Florida, large number of invasive aquatic weeds, and they can also be grouped by sun or shade. And then plant parts can be either more herbaceous or woody. So probably the most important way that we group weeds and identify them is either as a broadleaf weed, grassy weed, or a sedge. So broadleaves, if you remember back to botany in Module 1, broadleaves are also dicots. If you remember that dicots are plants that when they first germinate have two small leaves, monocot only has one small leaf. Broadleaves are dicots. So their leaves can vary quite a bit in shape, but they always have netted veins. So if you look at the leaf, you look at the veins, if it's in a netted pattern, you know that it's a broadleaf or a dicot. Some examples would be any kind of clover, henbit, Florida pusley, and dollarweed. The second main group of types of weeds is grasses. If you remember from botany, grasses are also monocots. So if you look at the leaf and all the veins are parallel, you know that it's a monocot or a grass type of weed. So normally the blades are longer than they are wide. Many of these have hollow, rounded stems with nodes. A couple examples that you would find in a garden or in a lawn would be crabgrass, goosegrass, or torpedo grass. And the third main group of weeds, which is a group that we really did not cover in Module 1, are called sedges. Sedges are a relatively small group of plants. They have a solid triangular stem. So when the plant gets a little bit larger, starts to shoot up a stem that the flowers will eventually form on, if you grab the stem between your fingers and roll it, you'll feel that it's a triangular shaped stem. Sedges generally like very moist conditions. They'll grow in wet areas, areas of very heavy soil. And a couple examples of sedges are yellow nut sedge, purple nut sedge, and globe sedge. Another way that we look at weeds is by their life cycle. You remember that annuals are plants that grow for one season. It may be one full year, it may be much less than 1 year, but technically annuals will grow for one season and then reproduce by seed. So here in Florida, we have a lot of weeds that are summer annuals. They're going to germinate in the spring, grow during the summer, late summer, early fall. They're going to flower, produce seeds, and they die off in the fall. And then the next spring, they're going to come back again from the seeds they drop at the end of this summer. On the other hand, winter annuals are a whole nother group of weeds. They germinate in fall to late winter. So they're going to come up in the fall, grow all winter long, flower, set seeds, and then in the early spring when it starts to heat up, they're going to die back, drop their seeds, and then if allowed to do so, they're going to come back the next fall. Biennials take 2 years to complete their life cycle. The first year th're going to grow vegetatively, and then the second year they're going to continue growing, and at that point flower, set seeds, and then die. We really don't have too many of these in Florida. One example is the Carolina false dandelion. And then the third type of life cycle is a perennial weed. These are weeds that grow for more than 3 years. They can reproduce through seeds, stolons, rhizomes, corms, bulbs, tubers. Many of these different structures remain viable in the soil. So they may die back a little bit during the winter or during the summer, but they're always going to grow back from the existing plant parts. One example of this would be torpedo grass. So how should we go about managing weeds? We need to take an integrated approach. You might remember that we talked about integrated pest management in an earlier module. This same applies to weeds as it does to insects and plant diseases. So some of the steps that we could take include prevention, proper plant and site management, mechanical techniques, and chemicals as needed. So let's go ahead and go through all these different management techniques individually. Weeds can spread to new areas through soil amendments, mulches, basically any soil or plant material that you move onto your property can bring weeds along with it. Contaminated equipment is also a very good way to move weeds.
Infested plant material
plant
can
parts
bring weeds
from
and
one
weed
property
seeds
to
along with
another.
it.
If
Also,
any of you have somebody who cuts
infested
your
seed
lawn for you,
sources,
you always want to go out and buy certified
seeds,
and
This is
also
especially
insect pests and
important for any
diseases
type of grass
from
seed you want
yard
to
to
buy.
yard as they go
If you
during
look
the day.
closely
On the label, it will tell you what percentage weed seeds are in it, and it's usually a very small percentage, 1% or less normally. And of course, animals and people do a very good job of moving all kinds of stuff all over the place. So you see in this picture here, weed seeds many times will stick to your pants, stick to your shoelaces, they'll stick to your pets. And this is a strategy the weeds use to move their seeds from place to place. So you always want to be careful about moving weeds and moving weed seeds from one property to another. Now, many weed species naturally reproduce and move from one place to another by producing seed that blows around in the wind. So if you have a very weedy area near your garden, near your property, maybe an overgrown lot next door, all the weeds that grow over there and flower and set seeds are going to blow seeds potentially onto your property. So that's something you need to be aware of and try to limit or minimize the number of weeds that you have around your garden and around your property. Some of the specific integrated pest management strategies we can use to minimize weed problems on a piece of property are cultural strategies such as preparing the plant site correctly, proper irrigation, proper mowing. You always want to mow your lawn before the weeds have a chance to flower and set seeds. Otherwise, it's too late. All you're doing is just helping to spread the seeds more. Irrigation through mostly drip irrigation. That way you're watering just the plants and you're not watering the walkways or the open areas nearby and just encouraging weeds to grow there. Biological controls aren't as feasible for landscapes. There really aren't a whole lot of options for biological control. That's used in certain circumstances for mostly invasive weeds, invasive plants. Some examples would be the air potato beetle. There have been other beneficial insects released for other aquatic weeds, but for a homeowner, there's very few potential uses for biological control. Mechanical control, good old-fashioned pulling the weeds. You can pull them by hand. You can remove the seed heads. There's lots of different types of equipment for this. Hose, scuffle hose, all kinds of different attachments for shovels and rakes to help remove the weeds. And then herbicides you probably want to use as a last resort. But herbicides can be very effective at controlling weeds, but it's very important that you use it at the correct time and you use the correct chemical also. You're going to base that on exactly what type of weed you have. That's why identification is the most important first step with controlling weeds. Sometimes certain weeds can actually be used as an indicator of what kind of soil you have. If you have very compacted soil, Certain weeds are going to do very well there because they like compacted soil. Some examples would be goosegrass, annual bluegrass, and knotweed. If you have problems with nematodes, certain weeds are going to do very well. They can become hosts or holdover hosts for the nematodes, but nematodes are not going to damage or kill these weeds. They're still going to grow and produce well in the presence of nematodes. Some examples would be Florida parsley, sedges, and spurges. And certain other weeds grow very well in poorly drained soils. They like fairly wet areas. Sedges do very well in wet soil. Virginia buttonweed, dichondra, dollarweed. For an example, if you ever speak with a homeowner who has a St. Augustine lawn and they complain that they have a lot of dollarweed is growing very well, it's big, it's healthy, that probably is an indication they're watering their lawn too much, because dollarweed does very, very well in overly wet soils. Some methods of managing existing weeds would be good old-fashioned hand weeding. Just pull them up and dispose of them. You always want to do this before the weeds have had a chance to flower and set seed, though. Using any kind of plastic or fabric mulch can work very well also, very effective on flower beds. It doesn't work very well in any kind of garden where you're moving plants in and out. Let's say you have a garden where you put annual flowers in, you're switching them in and out on a regular basis, or a vegetable garden. Plastic and fabric mulches work much better on a planting bed that's not going to change. You might have bushes or plants growing in it. You could use the mulch, put down wood chip mulch on top of it to make it look attractive. That's going to be effective. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a number of different tools and gadgets on the market to help you pull weeds or help you eliminate weeds. And then herbicides can be very helpful, but you need to be very careful you're using the correct herbicide and you're using it correctly. Otherwise, you're going to have problems with killing your wanted lawn and wanted plants. So what exactly is an herbicide? An herbicide is a chemical that is toxic to one or more different plant species. Herbicides, like any other chemical, can present some level of toxicity to other organisms. As a general rule, if herbicides are used correctly and you use all the correct personal protection equipment, they can be used very safely for people. But a number of these, if you read the label closely, are highly toxic to fish and aquatic organisms. So you want to be very, very careful using it around any kind of body of water, creek, or pond. And of course, with any kind of pesticide, you want to wear the proper protective equipment. The minimum that this includes is gloves, eye protection, long pants, and long sleeve shirts. Many herbicides and other pesticides require you to wear more protective equipment. If it does, it's going to be written clearly on the label. Herbicides are classified several different ways. One way is by the application timing, whether it's a pre-emergent herbicide or a post-emergent herbicide, by plant translocation, whether the herbicide is actually taken inside of the plant and moved up and down through the xylem or phloem, or if it's just a contact herbicide. They can be classified by the types of weeds that they control and target, and also by their selectivity. Application timing refers to when the herbicide is applied. Is it applied before the weed sprouts and starts to grow, or is it applied after the weed is up and growing and you want to try to control it at that point? So generally, pre-emergent herbicides are soil applied. They're applied directly to the soil, and it's going to absorb through the root and kill the weed as it's emerging from the seed, so that it never gets a chance to start to sprout and grow. Post-emergent herbicides, on the other hand, are normally foliar applied, which means you're going to spray the herbicide on the plant, on the leaves, and then the plant either absorbs it into the leaves and it affects the plant and kills it that way, or it's a contact herbicide and it actually physically burns the leaves and kills the weed in that way. Pre-emergent herbicides can be just surface applied, which means that you apply the pre-emergent herbicide to the surface of the soil and don't do anything else afterwards. Other types have to be soil incorporated, which means that it needs to be turned into the soil profile. That way it doesn't degrade, it stays toxic in the soil, and will kill the emerging weed seeds that way. There's very, very few pre-emergent herbicides that are available for homeowners. Pre-emergents are used a lot more in commercial farming, commercial growers. A lot of nurseries will use them. They'll work it into the soil before they they pot up plants. So mostly the ones that are most commonly used for homeowners are going to be ones that control crabgrass, and you're going to apply them in the very early spring before the crabgrass germinates and starts to grow. If you're using a pre-emergent herbicide, though, very important that you apply it at the appropriate soil temperature for specific weed seed germination. It's very, very important that you have your timing down also. Pre-emergent herbicides need to be applied before the weeds start to germinate. If they germinate and they're all just maybe a half an inch tall, it's too late to use a pre-emergent herbicide at that point. Sometimes you're going to want to use two different applications 4 to 8 weeks apart. That way you get better control over weed seeds that might be germinating over a certain period of time. If you read the package, it may say to irrigate after you apply it. Very important that you follow those directions exactly and add just the right amount of irrigation. The irrigation is very important to work that herbicide into the soil, but too much irrigation is going to work it either too deeply into the soil or it's going to run off, and then it's not going to be very effective on the weed seeds. Much more commonly, though, homeowners will use post-emergent herbicides. These may be used on a lawn to kill weeds that are coming up in your turf, may be used in a flower bed for weeds that are coming up amongst your bushes, amongst your ornamental plantings. All of these work the best when the weeds are smaller than 2 or 3 inches. If you wait until the weeds are waist high, it's going to be very, very difficult to control them with an herbicide. Do not irrigate right after application and for at least 6 hours. Then again, you always want to defer to what it says on the label. Read the label thoroughly, and if it says do not irrigate for a certain period of time, be careful to follow the directions and don't irrigate. Don't mow if you've applied it to a lawn after application for at least 2 days. That gives the herbicide a good chance to make contact with the weeds and be taken up into the weeds so it could do its job. And then, of course, avoid spraying flowering weeds. Some of these herbicides, although not specifically toxic to bees, we always want to be careful and mindful of bees. So you want to be extra careful for any herbicides or insecticides you may be using around any kind of flowering weeds, because bees visit flowering weeds just as much as they do your vegetable garden. When it comes to herbicides, and this applies to insecticides and fungicides also, all chemicals are different. They're all going to work differently. They're all going to kill the intended target in different ways. So a number of post-emergent herbicides are taken up different ways into plants. Some of them are contact herbicides. An example of this would be paraquat, where the translocation is very, very limited in the plant, but wherever that herbicide hits the plant and the plant leaves, it will burn the heck out of those leaves and those weeds. Very, very effective herbicide. Other herbicides are more systemic, which means that the chemical is taken up into the plant, moved throughout the plant, and then affects whatever part of the plant it was designed to affect. An example of this would be glyphosate. That's the active ingredient that's in Roundup. So that's extensively translocated through the plant, through the weed, and that's why it does such a good job of completely killing the weed. But it's not going to work immediately. You may think from watching TV ads, if you use Roundup or glyphosate, your weeds are all going to die and be dead in 5-10 minutes, something like that. It really takes about a week for it to be completely effective. You may spray weeds in your flower bed, in your driveway, in the cracks of your concrete with glyphosate, and after a few days it seems like it's not working. Be patient. After about a week, all of a sudden the weeds will fall over and die, because it takes that much time for the chemical to translocate through the plant and affect the areas that it's going to affect and kill the weed. Selectivity is a very important component of herbicides. Some herbicides are designed to be selective, which means that ideally it's going to kill the weeds but not the crop. Obviously, if you're spraying an insecticide on your lawn, you want it to kill the weeds that you want to kill, but you don't want to kill your grass. Selective herbicides may kill some weeds, but not others. And then there's a lot of different selective herbicides on the market now. Pendimethalin, imazaquin, a number of others that are designed to kill certain weeds, but not other weeds. So it's very important that you know exactly what kind of lawn or plant you're spraying the herbicides amongst, and you have a really good idea of what kind of weed you're trying to kill. Is it a grassy weed? Is it a broadleaf? Is it a sedge? Because that's going to determine which herbicide you're going to use. Other herbicides are designed to be non-selective. This would include things like Roundup or glyphosate, which is going to kill pretty much any plant that you spray it on. So obviously, if you spray Roundup in your lawn to kill the weeds, you're going to kill your grass also, so you wouldn't want to use it in that situation. A couple of examples would be glyphosate and paraquat. The mode of action of an herbicide refers to the exact physiological process that the chemical in that herbicide is either blocking or triggering. So that's basically exactly how the herbicide kills the plant inside the plant. So different mode of actions refer to different ways that the plant is eventually killed. Some herbicides will cause leaf burn, other herbicides intraveinal chlorosis. That's where the leaf turns very yellow in between the veins. Other herbicides are going to stunt the weeds and then eventually kill the weeds. If the weed is stressed, the herbicide activity is going to be reduced. So technically, you want to make sure that the weeds are well watered and very healthy before you spray with an herbicide. And this kind of makes sense because if the herbicide is being translocated or moved around inside the weed, you want to make sure it's a healthy weed, taking up water, moving water very well throughout the weed to move the herbicide through quickly and effectively. That way the herbicide is going to be much more effective. If the weed is very water stressed, very dried out, not growing very well, if you use an herbicide at that point, it's not going to be anywhere near as effective. So where can these different various herbicides be used? You want to be very careful not to use certain herbicides in certain situations. Don't apply a pre-emergent herbicide to recently seeded turf, because then what happens is it's going to kill the grass seeds, and the grass seeds are not going to germinate. You want to be very careful for any sprigged lawns or freshly sodded lawns. You want to use half rates for a pre-emergence, and then no post-emergent applications right away until the turf has become very well established. So if your lawn is fully established, non-stressed, otherwise healthy, and you have to apply an herbicide to kill the weeds, that's the best time to do it. There are a number of products on the market now that's a combination of a fertilizer and an herbicide. These are commonly called weed and feed products. We do not recommend using weed and feed products here in Central Florida because your weed killing activities happen at a different time from your fertilizer activities. You're only going to want to put down a pre-emergent herbicide very, very early in the spring, long before it's time to fertilize. You're going to fertilize your lawn during the time of year when your grass is actively growing, and you may use a post-emergent spray herbicide at that point, but the weed and feed herbicides are generally a mixture of a pre-emergent type herbicide and a fertilizer. So they may work very well in other parts of the country, but we don't recommend them here in Florida because they don't work very well here in Florida. Of course, if you're ever applying an herbicide, you want to be very careful near your ornamentals. Any kind of spray, it's amazing just in a very, very, very light breeze, just how far those small droplets can drift. So if you're spraying really close to your prized azaleas or landscape plants, you get a little bit too close, or if there's a little bit of a breeze, you can damage your desirable plants. Many times we'll have people come to the office and they have something wrong. They have leaf spots, they have damage to an ornamental plant, and it turns out that either the homeowner or their service sprayed an herbicide nearby. If that happens with some herbicides, the plants will outgrow it. The leaves that actually got hit with the herbicide will become spotted, twisted, damaged, and die. But after that, the plant will regrow, reflush, and it'll be fine. Other herbicides will cause more longer-term problems. The plant will struggle and have disfigured, damaged foliage for much longer. Probably the two most commonly used herbicides for lawn care would be a product called 2,4-D, which is what we recommend to be used on a Bahia lawn for broadleaf weeds, and then atrazine can be used on St. Augustine lawns for broadleaf weed control. Now, it's very difficult to control any kind of grassy weeds in a lawn because if you think about it, you're trying to kill one type of grass that's growing amongst another type of grass. And grasses and broadleaves are technically metabolically a little bit different, so you can design a chemical that's going to kill one and not the other, but it's almost impossible to design an effective herbicide that's going to kill a grass growing amongst another type of grass, which would be your lawn, either Bahia, St. Augustine, or whatever type of lawn grass you have. So unfortunately for most homeowners, it's difficult to control those grassy weeds in a lawn, although there are products such as 2,4-D and atrazine that work very well on controlling the broadleaf weeds that you might find in your lawn. Very important when using any kind of pesticide that you read the label thoroughly and all the way from beginning to end. You must observe all the directions, the restrictions, precautions on pesticide labels. Many pesticides will have restrictions that will say, do not use in this area, on this plant, above this temperature. And if you're not aware of that and you don't follow those directions, you may end up with a disaster on your hand. I've spoken with a number of people who have inadvertently killed their lawn from using an herbicide at the wrong time of year or an incorrect herbicide for the wrong type of turf. So it's dangerous, wasteful, and illegal to do so otherwise. That's why we say that the label is the law. We're referring to herbicide and pesticide labels. Pay special attention to the restricted entry interval, the REI information. That's the amount of time where you have to stay out of the area before you can re-enter safely. Home lawns a lot of times have very high traffic of children and pets, homeowners, so it's important to make sure they don't enter the treated area during the REI. Very important to use the proper rates. Don't think that if you just mix up your herbicide double strength or a little bit extra, it's going to work better. Many times it'll work a lot worse, and other times it'll kill the weeds just fine and now kill your grass also. Be sure that you're using the correct type of applicator to apply the herbicide and the correct dosage. And also at the correct time of year. That's very important. A lot of herbicides will have temperature warnings on the package. It'll say do not use this herbicide when average daytime temperatures are above 80, 85, 90 degrees. And if you use them when it's hotter than that during the summer, there's a very good chance that you're going to damage plants that you don't want to damage. Some herbicides can only be used by licensed pesticide applicators. If you ever encounter a container of herbicide that says on the front of the label it's not intended for use by homeowners, don't use it. These things are specially certified and licensed for applicators. They're not the kind of things you'd be able to go to a big box store and be able to purchase anyway. So I think this is about it for weed section. As always, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to ask, contact me, and we're going to go over a lot more weed identification in class hands-on.